I heard him before I saw him, my son's voice cutting through the hallway like a blade. She's just a burden we carry. He didn't know I was standing behind the door. The same arms that once rocked him through colic and night terrors now shook from holding his words. He laughed as he walked away, light as if he'd dropped something heavy. He had me. And that night, with my hands still trembling, I rewrote my will in silence. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The smell of roasted chicken drifted through Margaret Ellis's small, neatly kept kitchen, the herbs crisping in the oven like a promise she had worked all afternoon to perfect. The dining table was already set, linen napkins folded into imperfect triangles, a small vase of late summer zinnias in the center, and family photos on the wall watching over like silent guests. Margaret smoothed her apron, adjusted her reading glasses on their chain, and checked the pie cooling on the counter. It wasn't extravagance, it was ritual. She wanted warmth in her home, no matter how cold her son had grown. Jason arrived with Cheryl at his side, both dressed like they'd stepped out of a financial firm's catalog. Cheryl's heels clicked across the hardwood with a sharpness that grated against the hum of Margaret's ceiling fan. Emma trailed behind them, her shoulders slightly hunched, the way young people shrink when they're caught between two worlds. Margaret noticed it instantly. Dinner began with forced pleasantries. Jason complimented the roast, though his fork scraped his plate with impatience. Cheryl picked at her salad leaves, barely hiding her distaste for the mismatched plates. Emma tried to bridge silences, asking about classes, about movies, about anything but what was really simmering beneath the surface. It was Jason who cracked first. He leaned back, loosening his tie, as if his own mother's dining room was suffocating him. "You know, Mom, elder care isn't cheap," he said, swirling his wine like it might soften the words. "Most people your age plan ahead. Assisted living, long-term care policies. These things don't just pay for themselves." Margaret kept her eyes on the carving knife, slicing meat with deliberate steadiness. "I water my plants. I drive to the grocery store. I don't need a nurse wiping my chin." Cheryl's voice slithered in, sweet but calculated. "There's Ridgeview on Glenwood. It's very nice. They have weekly socials, fitness classes, even chef-prepared meals. You'd make friends." Margaret looked up, locking eyes with her daughter-in-law. "I'm not dead. I can make my own meals and do my own damn crosswords." The air tightened. Even the zinnias seemed to wilt at the edge in the silence. Jason's jaw ticked, his patience thinning like a wire about to snap. "You don't get it, Mom. This isn't about pride. It's about reality. You're just a burden we carry. All the bills, the worry, the words landed harder than he knew. For a moment, Margaret didn't blink. She simply pressed her fork down against her plate, the tines squealing against porcelain, before setting it aside with a grace that betrayed nothing. Emma froze, fork suspended in midair, her eyes wide with disbelief. Margaret gave no rebuttal, no defense. The silence she chose was heavier than any argument, and it left Jason fidgeting with his cufflinks, Cheryl watching smugly, and Emma biting her lip so hard it turned white. Dinner ended in fragments, Jason retreating to the living room to scroll his phone, Cheryl fussing with her purse straps, as if eager to leave, and Emma lingering near the sink, whispering, "Grandma, you okay?" Margaret only gave her a small nod, her hand briefly brushing Emma's wrist in silent reassurance. When the house emptied, the quiet returned like an old companion. Margaret sat alone at the table, the smell of lemon cleaner faint under the heavier scent of roasted garlic. She stacked plates, rinsed glasses, her movements precise, ritualistic. Yet beneath each action ran a current, sharp and undeniable. Upstairs, she knelt before the cedar chest tucked against her bedroom wall. The fireproof box slid out with a low scrape. Her hands didn't tremble, not once, as she turned the key and opened it. Inside lay a life's worth of papers, insurance, pension, and at the very top, her will. Jason's name stared up at her in tidy legal print, bold with entitlement, primary heir, everything entrusted. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She pulled the pages free, carried them to her desk, and sat in the dim glow of the brass lamp. For a long moment she just stared, weighing years of sacrifice against the son who had just called her a burden. Then, with the same precision she once used to grade essays, she tore the document cleanly down the middle. The paper split with a sound sharp enough to echo through the quiet house. She didn't stop. She tore again and again until the pieces littered her lap like confetti for a celebration no one else knew had begun. Margaret brushed the scraps into the trash bin, straightened her shoulders, and lifted her chin toward the window. Out on the quiet cul-de-sac, the streetlights flickered on, casting long, defiant shadows. Her son believed she was a weight dragging him down. Tonight, she had begun to make herself something else entirely, something explosive, something he would never see coming. And as the torn will settled in the trash, Margaret Ellis smiled for the first time that evening. The shredded remains of Margaret's will still lay buried in her bedroom trash bin, but the act of tearing it hadn't been enough. It was a gesture, a spark, but now she felt the ember smoldering, demanding something more permanent. The silence of the house pressed in, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her next move. She crouched again by the cedar chest beneath her bed, sliding it out until the wood creaked across the floorboards. The fireproof lockbox was heavier than she remembered. Her fingers, thin but steady, turned the key and lifted the lid. Inside were the artifacts of a lifetime: envelopes with faded return addresses, insurance papers, pension records, and at the very bottom, a crisp folder marked Last Will and Testament. Margaret pulled it free. The legal print was neat, clinical, and merciless. Jason Ellis, sole heir. The words carried the weight of years. Years she had bent herself backward to make sure he had piano lessons, new cleats, a shot at college. Years she had gone without new coats so he could wear varsity jackets. Years she had been both teacher to 30 children and mother to one who never once considered how heavy the chalk dust felt in her lungs. She sat at the edge of the bed, thumbing the pages. The house was so quiet she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Her jaw set. Then, with the same precision she once used to red pen essays, she gripped the will with both hands and ripped it down the center. The sound was sharp, decisive, an execution by paper. Margaret didn't stop at one tear. She ripped it again and again until the fragments pooled around her feet. Pale scraps against the hardwood, like snow that would never melt. Burden, she muttered, the word foreign and bitter on her tongue. We'll see who carries who. The next morning, Nadine Russell shuffled into Margaret's kitchen without knocking. A habit formed over 40 years of friendship. She carried her trademark mason jar of iced tea and plopped it on the table as if declaring her presence. Her eyes, sharp as ever, went straight to the overflowing trash bin by the counter. Paper edges peeked out. Well, Nadine said, leaning in, either you finally quit clipping coupons or you've done something reckless. Margaret poured them both fresh coffee, steam rising between them. I quit something, she replied, sliding the sugar bowl closer. Nadine tugged one jagged page from the bin, scanning the heading before her eyebrows shot up. Well, I'll be damned. You went and executed him yourself, on paper. I'd have slapped him with a casserole dish if I were you, Nadine added, shaking her head. Margaret's lips twitched into the faintest smile. Paper cuts deeper. For a beat, they just sat, the clink of Nadine's spoon against ceramic filling the room. Outside, the neighborhood was waking, sprinklers hissing across manicured lawns, a delivery truck groaning down the cul-de-sac. Inside, Margaret's kitchen felt like a command center, quiet but charged. Later that day, her phone buzzed. A text from Emma. Are you okay, Grandma? I couldn't sleep after dinner. The words carried worry and tenderness that sliced deeper than Jason's cruelty. Margaret typed back slowly, each letter deliberate. I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't you worry about me. Then she set the phone face down on the counter, staring at the cracked tile grout, as if it might reveal the future. But the unease wouldn't leave. She had torn Jason's name off the page, but destruction wasn't creation. A will wasn't just about what you erased. It was about what you built in its place. The thought crawled under her skin and wouldn't let go. That evening, after washing dishes and setting them to dry, Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the living room. She lowered herself into the armchair, pulled her laptop from its case, and opened the browser. The glow from the screen washed over her glasses. Her fingers hovered for a long second before she typed, slowly but firmly, "Estate attorneys near me." The results popped up. Names, phone numbers, polished headshots promising security. Margaret leaned back, lips pressed together. She wasn't just tearing paper anymore. She was rewriting her ending, line by line, clause by clause. And as she scrolled past the first few ads, her eyes narrowed, already hunting for the one who could help her finish what she had just begun. Margaret stared at the glow of her laptop long after the search results had loaded, her finger tracing slow circles on the mouse pad. The names all looked the same: bold fonts, hollow smiles, men in stiff suits promising peace of mind. As if that came from a brochure. She scrolled past them, hunting for someone who didn't look like a salesman. And then she saw it: Wagner and Associates, probate and estate law. The headshot was grainy, the suit a little wrinkled, but the name hit her chest with recognition. Doug Wagner. She hadn't seen that face in nearly 20 years. Not since the union rallies when he'd defended teachers' pensions like a soldier at the front line. He had spoken then with a kind of grit you couldn't fake, less polished, more battle-worn. If anyone could handle Jason, it would be him. Her hand hovered over the phone for a moment. Then she dialed. Wagner and Associates, a receptionist answered, brisk and professional. "This is Margaret Ellis," she said, her voice steady. "I need to speak with Doug." A brief hold, muffled shuffling, and then a familiar voice boomed through the line. "Margaret Ellis? I'll be damned. You're still terrifying, aren't you?" She let out a dry chuckle. "Not terrifying. Just tired of amateurs trying to write my ending." "That's so." Doug's voice carried a smile, but sharpened quickly. "What's going on?" "I need to clean house, Doug. Starting with my will." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers being shuffled aside. "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring everything you've got. We'll make this ironclad." Margaret closed her eyes, relief loosening the knot in her chest. "Ironclad isn't enough," she said softly. "I want biblical." Doug barked a laugh. Still dramatic as ever, 10 a.m. sharp. When she hung up, the room seemed lighter, though the silence pressed just as thick. She sat back in her chair, letting the rhythm of the ticking clock settle her. A plan was forming, not just defiance, but strategy. That afternoon, Nadine stopped by again, this time with a grocery bag dangling from her wrist. "You looked like hell yesterday, so I brought you some of my peach cobbler. Sugar's better than prayer." She plopped the bag on the counter, eyes narrowing when she saw the laptop still open. "What's this? You Googling dates?" "Hardly." Margaret pushed her glasses up her nose. "I called a lawyer." Nadine's jaw dropped, then curled into a grin. "About damn time." "Who?" "Doug Wagner. Remember him? Union days." "Oh Lord, yes." Nadine chuckled, pulling out the cobbler. That man had more fire than a Baptist preacher. "What's the plan? You rewriting the Bible?" "Just the ending," Margaret replied, voice flat but certain. Nadine studied her for a moment, the joking fading into something more solemn. "Well, then make it a good one." They ate cobbler at the kitchen table, the cinnamon sweet on their tongues, the weight of unspoken years sitting between them. Margaret's mind ticked through documents, bank accounts, her pension. Every detail mattered now. That night, she gathered folders from the cedar chest, lining them across her desk in neat stacks. She checked her pension statements, utility bills, property deed. Everything had to be in order before tomorrow. Every paper was another nail Jason wouldn't be able to pry loose. She slid the final folder into her tote bag just as headlights swept across the curtains. Jason's SUV idled briefly in front of her house before rolling past. Margaret froze at the window, the engine hum fading into the night. He hadn't stopped, hadn't knocked, but he was circling, watching. Margaret's spine stiffened. If he wanted to watch, let him. He had no idea what was coming. The next morning, with her tote bag by the door, she stepped outside to collect the mail. The cul-de-sac smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, sprinklers still ticking from her neighbor's yard. She pulled the envelopes free, and her stomach hardened. There they were, glossy and smug. Brochures from Ridgeview Assisted Living, addressed in Jason's neat hand but delivered to her home. She flipped through the shiny pages, smiling seniors in pastel sweaters, holding shuffleboard sticks as if they were trophies. The stage cheer of it all made her grip tighten until the edges bent. Margaret tucked the stack under her arm, her jaw clenched, eyes narrowing with something close to fury. Jason thought he was writing her next chapter with marketing mail. Tomorrow she'd let Doug Wagner hand her the pen instead. The brochures felt heavier than paper had any right to be. Margaret stood at the edge of her driveway, the sun catching the glossy covers and making them glare. Smiling couples held hands beneath scripted slogans. The golden years, redefined. Comfort, care, and community. The envelopes were addressed to Jason but delivered here, as if her home had already been reassigned. As if she were a package being forwarded to her final destination. She didn't carry them inside. She marched straight to the backyard, tossed the stack onto the lid of her old barbecue grill, and lifted the cover. The hinges squealed, a tired protest that matched the one in her chest. She struck a match, the sulfur sharp in her nose, and touched it to the corner of the brochure. The flame caught quick, spreading across the pages until Ridgeview's pastel-colored promises curled black. Margaret watched the fire chew through smiling strangers' faces, listened to the paper crackle like brittle bones. Smoke lifted into the late afternoon air, smelling of ink and burnt lies. She didn't flinch, not even when the edges flared brighter, reflecting in her glasses like a warning signal. By the time the flames guttered out, nothing remained but ash dusting the coals. A car door slammed at the front of the house. Margaret turned to see Emma jogging down the driveway, backpack slung over one shoulder. Her granddaughter's face was pink from the heat, her expression worried. "Grandma," Emma called, rounding the corner into the backyard. Her eyes went wide when she saw the smoking grill. "What are you doing?" Margaret tapped the ashes off her hands like she was brushing off flour. "Housekeeping." Emma dropped her backpack onto the patio chair. "Were those, oh my God, they were Ridgeview brochures, weren't they?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "Dad and Cheryl are planning this without even asking you." Margaret's mouth curved into a cool half-smile. "They'll learn not to underestimate a school teacher." Emma shook her head, pacing in tight circles. "This isn't fair. You don't need Ridgeview. You don't need—" She stopped herself, cheeks hot, eyes bright with unshed tears. Margaret reached out, gently steadying her. "Fairness is a child's word, sweetheart. I don't need fairness. I need leverage." The following morning, Doug Wagner's office smelled faintly of old books and strong coffee. The walls were lined with law journals and framed photographs of him at rallies decades ago, bullhorn in hand, eyes blazing. He greeted Margaret with a firm handshake that squeezed reassurance into her bones. "You brought the papers?" he asked, motioning her into a seat. Margaret slid the tote bag across his desk, thick with folders. Every dime, every account, every deed. "I didn't raise a fool, Doug." At least not until Jason turned 40, Doug rifled through the papers, nodding. "This will work. We'll tighten every clause. Jason won't find a crack big enough to slip through." From the waiting area, Nadine's voice cut through like a trumpet. "You need a witness for this rewrite, Margaret. Because I came prepared with iced tea and opinions. Doug leaned back, smirking. She's still your shadow, huh? Margaret gave Nadine a side eye as she swept into the office, her straw clinking against the mason jar. Better a shadow than a vulture, she said, settling herself like she owned the place. For the next hour, Margaret answered Doug's questions, crisp and unflinching. Birth certificates, account numbers, property boundaries. She spoke with the rhythm of a teacher reciting lesson plans, her voice steady even when Doug prodded at painful topics, health directives, power of attorney, long-term care. When the paperwork was finally stacked in neat piles, Doug leaned forward, his tone serious. This will make enemies of him, Margaret. Are you ready for that? Margaret's eyes narrowed, sharp as chalk lines on a board. He made me his enemy when he called me a burden. Doug nodded slowly. Then let's make this ironclad. Ironclad isn't enough, she said, recalling the brochures curling in flame. Make it unbreakable. By the time she returned home, the air outside was cooler, dusk settling over the cul-de-sac. She unlocked the front door, set her tote bag on the table, and reached for her phone to check messages. A new text blinked across the screen. Jason, we need to talk about your house. Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone, her jaw locking. The war had officially begun. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Margaret sat across from Doug Wagner in his law office, the stack of fresh documents laid neatly before her. Outside, traffic murmured down the boulevard, muffled through thick glass, but in the quiet of the office, every rustle of paper carried the weight of finality. Doug adjusted his glasses, tapping the top page with a blunt finger. This is it. The rewrite. Once you sign, it's official. Margaret smoothed her hand over the desk's polished wood, staring at her own name in the bold header. And Jason? Gone, Doug said, his tone steady but edged. No inheritance, no fallback. He's been erased from this story. The words filled the air like a verdict. Margaret let them settle before leaning forward, lifting the pen and pressing it to the page. Each stroke of her signature felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Deliberate, irreversible. When she finished, Doug slid the documents into a folder with practiced efficiency. Emma is the sole heir. But the trust is structured. She won't see the bulk until 30. It's timed, smart, and safe. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze softening. She deserves the future her father tried to strip from me. Doug nodded, pulling another sheet from the stack. And a portion, per your request, goes to the teacher's pension crisis fund. That's locked in. No one can touch it. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. Let Jason choke on that irony, Doug chuckled, though his tone was serious as he slid the last clause across the table. One more safeguard, a no-contest clause. If Jason tries to fight this, he risks forfeiting everything. Even if he somehow found a foothold, this language cuts him off. Margaret read the words carefully, savoring the sharpness of their design. Perfect. It's not just a will anymore, Doug. It's a lesson plan. The tension in her chest eased for the first time in weeks. The future no longer belonged to Jason's arrogance. It belonged to Emma, to the legacy Margaret chose, not the one dictated by entitlement. Nadine, perched in the corner chair with her ever-present mason jar of iced tea, broke the quiet. Margaret Ellis, you're scarier than midterms. Margaret gave her a sideways glance. Midterms can be studied for. I prefer pop quizzes. The room broke into brief laughter. But beneath it pulsed something sharper, an awareness that this wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration of independence, an act of war sealed in ink. Doug leaned back, folding his hands. You understand this won't end quietly, don't you? Jason and Cheryl won't go down easy. Margaret met his gaze without blinking. I didn't raise easy. I raised entitled. And now I'll raise hell. The documents, once terrifying in their implications, now sat before her like a shield. Margaret gathered her tote bag, sliding the folder inside as if holstering a weapon. The air outside was thick with late summer heat when she stepped onto the street. but she carried herself lighter than she had in years. Nadine trailed behind her, whispering as they walked toward the car. "You ever think about how sweet this is? You just pulled the rug out from under him with one signature." Margaret glanced at the sky, the light turning gold across the tops of the office buildings. It's sweeter knowing he doesn't even see it coming. By the time she returned home, the sun had begun its descent, painting the cul-de-sac in long shadows. She unlocked the door, humming faintly under her breath, her tote bag snug against her hip like a secret she wasn't ready to share. She had just set her keys on the table when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the house, sharp and insistent. Margaret frowned, peering through the sidelight window. Cheryl Ellis stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression sharp enough to slice glass. Margaret opened the door only halfway, resting her weight against it. "Cheryl." "Margaret," Cheryl replied, her voice as tight as her smile. "Jason's worried about you." Margaret cocked an eyebrow. "Worried? That's rich." Cheryl smoothed the front of her blouse, stepping slightly closer to the threshold. The faint smell of her perfume, something sharp and citrusy, drifted in. "He says you've been forgetful lately, misplacing things, repeating yourself, that sort of thing." Margaret's lips parted into a slow, deliberate grin. "Forgetful, you say? Funny, I still remember how Jason wet the bed until he was 9. Vivid as yesterday, Cheryl's face twitched, the perfect polish of her expression cracking for a fraction of a second. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly, her voice clipped. "I know what you meant," Margaret said, leaning against the doorframe. "You meant to imply my mind is slipping." "Try harder," Cheryl pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth, considering her next angle. "Have you updated your will recently?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes gave her away, sharp, probing, hungry. Margaret let the silence stretch just long enough to make Cheryl uncomfortable. Then she tilted her head, eyes glinting behind her glasses. "Fresh ink, sweetheart." That landed like a stone dropped in still water. Cheryl blinked, her composure faltering, a flash of something ugly crossing her face, before she smoothed it back down. "Well," she said finally, her words brittle, "I hope you've made good decisions. For everyone's sake." "Don't you worry," Margaret replied, her tone dry as chalk dust. "I always grade fairly." The standoff lingered, broken only when a car door clicked at the curb. Cheryl turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing at the sight of Emma sitting behind the wheel of her old sedan, phone angled just subtly enough to capture the exchange. Emma lifted her chin in a quiet defiance, her camera recording the brittle smile Cheryl plastered back onto her face. "Well," Cheryl repeated, her voice high and falsely sweet, "I'll let you rest. Have a good evening." Margaret eased the door shut, not slamming it, just letting the latch click into place like a punctuation mark. Through the glass, she watched Cheryl retreat down the walkway, her heels stabbing the pavement harder than necessary. Inside, Margaret's pulse slowed. She turned, resting her back against the door, a low chuckle bubbling up despite herself. Fresh ink, indeed. Moments later, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Emma. "Got the whole thing recorded. Dad's gonna hate this," Margaret typed back. "Good girl. Keep it safe." Then she slipped the phone into her pocket, walking toward the kitchen as the light outside dimmed into night. But Jason wasn't a man to leave battles unfinished. 2 days later, an envelope arrived in Margaret's mailbox, tucked between utility bills and grocery coupons. The return address wasn't Ridgeview this time. It was the Wake County Department of Social Services. The notice inside was cold, bureaucratic. Adult Protective Services has received a report concerning your mental capacity. A wellness check will be scheduled. Margaret read the words twice, her fingers tightening on the page until the edges bent. Jason had made his move. The knock on Margaret's door wasn't the friendly rap of a neighbor or the sharp sting of Cheryl's manicured nails. It was official, measured, deliberate, the kind of knock that carried authority behind it. Margaret set down her crossword puzzle, marked in red ink like a student's exam, and straightened her blouse before answering. A woman stood on the porch, clipboard tucked under one arm, badge clipped neatly to her cardigan. Her expression was polite but cautious, the kind of neutrality trained into government workers. Mrs. Ellis, my name is Sandra Holt. I'm with Adult Protective Services. We received a report concerning your mental capacity. I need to conduct a brief wellness check. Margaret didn't flinch. Come in, Miss Holt. I've been expecting you. The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and brewed tea. Family photos lined the mantel, Jason in a graduation gown, Emma with gap-toothed smiles, Margaret and her late husband on their wedding day. Every detail whispered order, stability, life lived on her own terms. Sandra set her clipboard on the coffee table. I'll just ask you a few questions. Nothing intrusive, Margaret waved toward the sofa. You'll forgive me if I grade you back. Occupational hazard of teaching 30 years. The investigator smiled despite herself, pulling a pen from her pocket. But before she could ask the first question, Margaret rose, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew her strength was under. Evaluation, she brought out 2 mugs of tea, setting one gently in front of Sandra. Beside it, she placed a stapled packet. Sandra raised an eyebrow. What's this? My crossword puzzle scorecard. Every puzzle from the last 6 weeks, completed in pen, timed and graded. Margaret settled back into her armchair, folding her hands neatly. You'll notice my scores have gone up. Cognitive function tends to do that when you're irritated. Sandra flipped through the pages, her brows rising at the meticulous notes. Circled clues, red ink comments like sloppy thinking and excellent recall. She looked up slowly, amusement creeping into her face. You seem extremely lucid. Good, Margaret said, sipping her tea. Because my son thinks otherwise. He's trying to rewrite me before I'm finished writing myself. The interview lasted another 20 minutes. Margaret named every governor in the last 20 years, recited her prescription list, and even rattled off her neighbor's Wi-Fi password. Because she keeps asking me to fix her Roku. By the end, Sandra was nodding, her pen pausing more often than writing. When she finally stood to leave, she clasped Margaret's hand warmly. I'll be filing a report. Expect it to say you're sharper than half the staff at my office. Make sure you spell sharper correctly, Margaret replied dryly. As soon as the door shut, Margaret's phone buzzed. Emma's name lit the screen. Grandma, I've got something, Emma said, her voice low but urgent. Remember when Cheryl came over the other night? I recorded it from my car. Her fishing about your will. It's all on audio. Want me to send it to Doug? Margaret's pulse quickened with satisfaction. Send it, immediately. By the next morning, Doug had the recording in his inbox. He called Margaret before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. This is gold, not just harassment, it shows intent. Cheryl practically gift-wrapped it. Wrap it tight, Doug, Margaret said. Tie a bow on it. I'll draft a formal response. A PS will close the file, but this recording, it'll make Jason and Cheryl look like amateurs in court. Margaret leaned back, the morning light spilling across her kitchen table, illuminating the crossword puzzle, waiting for red ink. I grade manipulators like essays, she said, and they're both failing. For the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of victory, however small. The report they had filed was dissolving into smoke, and her paper trail was stronger than ever, but even smoke can mask fire. That evening, while Margaret thumbed through her mail, Jason was busy on another front. Sitting in his office after hours, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot from stress, he logged into her accounts using information only a son would know. He pulled up her credit report, his fingers hesitating just briefly before clicking the option. Freeze? Account. Margaret, miles away, had no idea the next blow was already on its way. The pharmacist's smile faltered as she slid Margaret's prescription bag back across the counter. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ellis. Your card's been declined, Margaret blinked. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the faint smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose. Run it again. Her voice was calm, but her chest tightened. The young woman tried once more, pressing the buttons with extra care, as if politeness could soften humiliation. Same error. Transaction denied. Margaret's cheeks heated. Around her, customers shuffled in line, impatient, whispering to each other. She gathered herself, straightening her shoulders. "I'll pay in cash," she said, slipping bills across the counter with steady fingers. But inside, something snapped. Back home, Margaret called Doug before she even set the pill bottle on the counter. "My card was declined at the pharmacy," she said. "My account's something's wrong." Doug's voice sharpened. "Don't move." "Let me check," keys clacked in the background. A pause, then a low curse. "Margaret, Jason filed a freeze on your credit report. He impersonated you." Her stomach sank, equal parts fury and disbelief. "He's trying to strangle me financially." "That's not just interference," Doug said grimly. "That's identity fraud. Financial abuse. I'll open a case immediately." The words were cold comfort. Margaret stared at the neat stacks of bills on her kitchen counter, suddenly transformed into reminders of vulnerability. Yet her jaw locked. If Jason thought money would break her, he'd forgotten who had raised him on a teacher's salary and still paid off a house. Emma showed up that evening, laptop tucked under her arm, eyes stormy. "Grandma, I found emails," she said, dropping into a chair. "Dad's been hinting at this for months, talking about controlling assets, saying you'd thank him later. He even told Cheryl he could lock things down if you acted out." Margaret's chest burned. "Acted out?" She spat the words like something bitter. "He's trying to rewrite reality itself." Emma pulled up the emails on the screen, each line damning in its smug arrogance. Margaret read them carefully, her red pen in hand, underlining phrases, scrawling notes in the margins as if she were grading his lies. Doug called back that night, his voice more determined than weary. "I filed subpoenas for his bank logins and account activity. We'll get a full picture. He won't be able to hide behind his financial firm's reputation anymore." From the corner, Nadine piped up, sipping iced tea loud enough to punctuate her words. "Hope he enjoys orange jumpsuits, because I can already see him trading that tie for stripes." Margaret smirked despite the weight in her chest. Orange clashes with arrogance. He'll look terrible, the next few days blurred with paperwork, sworn statements, and Doug's measured reassurances. Margaret played her role like a seasoned educator, patient, meticulous, unflinching. She kept copies of everything in binders, color-coded tabs marking each category. Emails, bank statements, APS report. Organization was her shield. But beneath the order simmered something far hotter. Rage. Not the kind that exploded, but the kind that calcified, that turned every heartbeat into resolve. Jason hadn't just tried to humiliate her at dinner or manipulate her with brochures. He had touched the marrow of her independence, the ability to stand on her own 2 feet. That was unforgivable. When Doug called again, his voice carried both triumph and warning. "The court has reviewed the evidence. They've set a hearing date. Jason Ellis will face financial fraud charges." Margaret pressed the phone tight to her ear, her free hand curling into a fist. The sound of the clock ticking in her kitchen grew louder, steadier, like a drumbeat of inevitability. She hung up and stood by the window, looking out at the quiet cul-de-sac. Children rode bikes in lazy circles. Neighbors watered lawns. Life hummed on as if nothing had shifted. But Margaret knew the truth. The battle lines were no longer invisible. Her son was heading for court. The courtroom was colder than Margaret expected, the air conditioning humming above polished wood and echoing footsteps. She sat at the plaintiff's table beside Doug, her tote bag at her feet like armor. Every binder inside was color-coded, every tab a weapon. Across the aisle, Jason adjusted his cufflinks, jaw tight, while Cheryl sat rigid beside him, her posture more brittle than elegant. The bailiff's voice carried like a hammer. "All rise!" The judge entered, black robe swaying, his expression unreadable. Margaret rose, spine straight as a ruler, and when she sat again, she clasped her hands calmly on the table. Doug leaned close, murmuring, "Stay steady." Let the evidence do the heavy lifting. Jason was called first. He stepped to the stand with a false ease, rehearsed in the art of looking composed. His voice was smooth, the same tone he probably used to woo clients at his financial firm. "I wasn't trying to harm my mother," he claimed. "I was only trying to protect her. She's been forgetful, vulnerable. I froze her accounts temporarily for her own good." Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't move. Doug gave her a small nod. "Wait," Jason continued, embellishing details, even feigning a pained expression. "It was precautionary. Nothing more. I love my mother, but sometimes parents need their children to step in." Doug rose slowly, papers in hand. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "I'd like to introduce Exhibit A." Emma, sitting in the gallery, leaned forward as Doug handed the judge a stack of printed emails. "These are communications between Mr. Ellis and his wife, Cheryl. In them, Mr. Ellis boasts about locking things down and describes his mother as, quote, a liability." Jason's face drained of color. Those are out of context," he stammered. Doug's tone sharpened. "Context? Let's add more." He pressed play on Emma's recording, Cheryl's voice filling the courtroom. "Have you updated your will recently?" And Margaret's cool reply, "Fresh ink, sweetheart." The gallery shifted with murmurs. Cheryl froze in her seat, her nails digging into her clutch until her knuckles whitened. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Ellis, you told this court your actions were precautionary. Yet these documents and recordings suggest premeditation." Intent. Jason tried to recover, words tumbling. "My mother, she doesn't know what she's doing with her finances anymore. Doug cut him off. "Then explain this." He slid forward the APS report, Sandra Holt's official findings stamped with the county seal. "Independent evaluation. Mrs. Ellis is not only competent, she was described as, and I quote, sharper than half the staff in my office." The words landed like a gavel before the gavel. The judge turned his gaze on Cheryl. "Mrs. Ellis, please step forward." Cheryl's heels clicked like gunshots as she approached the stand. Her face was pale, her usual composure unraveling. Under oath, Doug's questions cut methodically. Had she asked Margaret about her will? Had she pressured her about Ridgeview? Had she discussed her mother-in-law's finances with Jason? Each answer grew thinner, weaker. By the time she stepped down, Cheryl's mask had cracked entirely, sweat beading along her temple. Margaret finally took the stand. She walked with measured steps, her voice steady as she addressed the court. She didn't plead, didn't dramatize. She spoke like she was in front of a classroom again, calm, firm, and thorough. She described the pharmacy incident, the humiliation of her card being declined, the ash of Ridgeview brochures in her barbecue pit. Every detail was precise, unshakable. "I am 76 years old," she concluded, her gaze locking on Jason. "I can still solve crosswords in pen. I can still drive myself to the grocery store. And I can certainly still recognize manipulation when I see it. I am not weak. I am not a burden. I am a witness to the lengths my son will go to rewrite my life before it's finished." The silence that followed was thicker than any argument Jason could muster. The judge leaned forward, his tone firm. "This court rules in favor of Mrs. Ellis. The attempted fraud is noted, and further action will proceed through the proper channels." He banged the gavel once, final and echoing. Margaret exhaled, a calm she hadn't felt in months spreading through her chest. Doug squeezed her shoulder. Emma's eyes shone with quiet pride, and Nadine whispered from the back row, "You passed that test with extra credit." But outside the courtroom, another storm was already brewing. Jason's financial firm had received notice of the proceedings, and now an internal report was circulating. One of their own had been charged with identity fraud. Margaret didn't know it yet, but her son's career was about to unravel. The morning after the ruling, Jason's office buzzed with whispers. Colleagues avoided his eye as he strode through the glass lobby, his tie too tight. His jaw clenched. The usual rhythm of greetings and nods was replaced by sidelong glances and hurried conversations that stopped when he entered. By the time he reached his desk, a red email notification pulsed on his screen. Mandatory meeting, compliance department, immediate. Inside the boardroom, the firm's senior partners sat stiff, files stacked in front of them. Jason lowered himself into a chair, the leather groaning under his weight. A partner cleared his throat. "We received court records yesterday, identity fraud allegations. Against your own mother." His voice carried no sympathy, only quiet disgust. "Pending review, you are suspended." Effective immediately, Jason opened his mouth, but no defense came. The silence pressed against him until he felt smaller than he'd ever allowed himself to be. Back on the cul-de-sac, Margaret wasn't surprised when Emma texted her a link to the firm's website. Jason's profile, the glossy headshot, the bio full of buzzwords like integrity and family-first values, was gone. Erased as cleanly as Margaret had struck his name from her will. She clicked the link twice just to make sure. When the page loaded blank a second time, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling through her nose. So much for integrity. Her phone buzzed again, this time with Nadine's voice message. Guess who just posted on Facebook? Cheryl said, and I quote, "When snakes bite themselves, you don't need a shovel." Lord, that woman's got venom. Margaret allowed herself the smallest chuckle. Let her hiss. The sound doesn't change the bite. By afternoon, Emma arrived, dropping her backpack on the floor with a thud. Her face was pale, her eyes tight with worry. "Grandma, Dad's spinning out. He called me twice this morning, left voicemails, angry, rambling. Said none of this is fair, that you've poisoned me against him." Margaret poured Emma a glass of iced tea, sliding it across the table. "He gambled his mother. He lost his career. The only person poisoning him is himself." Emma's eyes welled, but she steadied her voice. "It's like he doesn't even see what he's done. He keeps saying he just wanted to protect you." Margaret's lips curled, bitter and wry. "Protect me? Number. He wanted to script my life, as if I were one of his reports. But here's the thing, Emma. He had the pen. I had the paragraphs. And the paragraphs always outlast the pen." The words hung between them, heavy but steadying, like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Emma nodded, clutching the glass tighter. Later that week, Margaret sat once again across from Doug in his office, the smell of stale coffee and paper filling the air. He tapped the new draft of the trust with his pen. "Given everything Jason's tried, I've added extra contingencies. Layered protections. He can't touch a cent. Emma's inheritance is sealed tighter than Fort Knox." Margaret flipped through the pages, the language dense but deliberate. She nodded, satisfied. "Good, he's already tried the door and the windows. Let's brick up the chimney while we're at it." Doug smiled faintly. "You think like a general." "I taught history," Margaret replied. "Generals lose when they underestimate the quiet ones." But as Margaret walked back to her car, tote bag pressed to her side, a new message buzzed on her phone. Jason again. This one wasn't rambling, it was pointed, short, and filled with venom. "I'm contesting the will. See you back in court." Margaret stood in the parking lot, the late afternoon sun beating down, the cicadas buzzing like a warning siren. She tightened her grip on the phone until her knuckles ached. The war wasn't over. Jason wasn't done. The summons arrived like a slap. Jason Ellis contesting the will. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the paper trembling only because the ceiling fan above stirred the air. She traced the bold print with her finger. Her son wasn't just fighting, he was clawing for scraps he believed belonged to him. Doug had predicted this. It was only a matter of time, he told her over the phone, his voice steady. But the no contest clause is a guillotine. If he pushes too hard, he risks losing everything, what little was even left to him. Still, preparation mattered. And this time, it wasn't just Margaret's composure on the line. Emma was called as a potential witness. They met in Doug's office, the old, books and stale coffee smell grounding them. Doug adjusted his glasses, turning to Emma. They'll try to rattle you. Twist your words. Keep your answers simple. Truth is on your side. Emma nodded, hands clasped in her lap, but her leg bounced under the table. Margaret reached over, pressing her granddaughter's knee gently. You've got this, sweetheart. Remember, he can't fail you if you don't let him grade you. A small smile broke across Emma's face, tension easing for a moment. Meanwhile, Margaret underwent the evaluation Jason demanded. A third-party psychologist sat across from her in a neutral beige office, pen poised. Mrs. Ellis, I'll need to test your recall, reasoning, memory. Margaret leaned back, unbothered. Start whenever you like. I've taught teenagers. Nothing scares me. She answered every question with precision, naming governors, spelling words backward, rattling off math problems faster than the examiner expected. At the end, she pulled a crossword from her purse, sliding it across the table. Finished this morning, in ink. You can grade it if you like, the psychologist chuckled, shaking his head. Mrs. Ellis, you are sharper than most 60-year-olds I've seen. You passed easily, Margaret stood, smoothing her blouse. Tell my son that. He seems confused about who needs the caretaking across town. Cheryl rehearsed Jason like an actor before a play. In their kitchen, wine glasses on the counter, she pressed him with questions. You need to emphasize concern. Say you were only protecting her. Don't mention the emails Jason paced, sweat beating at his temple. She's turning Emma against me. She's painting me like some kind of criminal. Cheryl grabbed his arm, nails digging in. Then act like a son who cares. If you lose this, Jason, we're finished. The court date came fast. Margaret entered the courthouse with Doug at her side, Emma just behind, clutching her notebook like a talisman. Jason and Cheryl waited across the aisle, tension visible in the set of their shoulders. The judge presided with sharp efficiency, flipping through documents, listening to testimony. Jason took the stand first, repeating the same tired defense, concern for his mother, her alleged decline, his supposed responsibility. Cheryl's eyes bored into him, willing him to stay on script. Then Doug rose, holding the evaluation report. Your Honor, the independent psychological assessment concludes Mrs. Ellis is fully competent. In fact, the examiner noted her mental sharpness exceeds average. Jason fumbled, his face flushing. She's putting on an act. The judge raised a hand. Enough. The facts speak clearly. He turned a page, eyes narrowing. This will contain a no contest clause. Mr. Ellis, by filing this appeal, you've risked what little you might have claimed. The appeal is dismissed. With prejudice, the gavel struck once, final and echoing. Margaret exhaled, her hand finding Emma's. Doug leaned closer, whispering, That's the last nail, Margaret. He can't touch your legacy anymore. Across the aisle, Jason slumped, Cheryl's face twisting in fury. The crumble of their alliance was visible, cracks spreading like lightning through glass. Margaret walked out of the courthouse with her head high, the sun hitting her face, warmth cutting through the cool weight of the courtroom. For once, victory didn't feel loud. It felt clean. But as she slid into the passenger seat of Doug's car, her phone buzzed with a new number. She answered cautiously. Mrs. Ellis, this is Lauren Price, reporter with the News and Observer. I've been following your case. Would you be willing to talk about your experience with elder abuse? Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. A new battlefield was opening, this one in the public eye. The phone interview was supposed to last 10 minutes. Margaret ended up talking for nearly an hour. Lauren Price, the reporter from the News and Observer, had a voice that was steady but probing. She asked about court filings, about Jason's fraud, about the will. Margaret answered carefully, choosing words like chess moves. I'm not the first parent to be called a burden, she said, her voice calm but edged. But I might be one of the first to grade my own son's scheme like an essay. and fail him in front of a judge. Lauren chuckled softly on the line. That's a quote if I've ever heard one. 2 days later, the headline stretched across the metro section. Retired teacher outsmarts son in a state battle. Margaret's photo, taken years ago at a union rally, accompanied the piece. Her chin high, fist raised, a whistle hanging from her neck. The article detailed the fraud, the no contest clause, even the Ridgeview brochures she'd burned. When Emma posted the link on Facebook, the reaction spread faster than either of them expected. Shares multiplied. Former students left comments. She taught me AP history, toughest teacher I ever had. Mrs. Ellis never let anyone slack, old colleagues chimed in. Neighbors added hearts and angry face emojis side by side. By nightfall, the story had gone semi-viral across Raleigh. Margaret didn't scroll through the comments. She let Emma read some aloud, though, as they sat together on the floral couch. Listen to this one, Emma said, grinning. If she taught my kid how to pass state exams, no wonder she could outsmart a financial advisor. Margaret shook her head, hiding a smile behind her teacup. I'm becoming a folk tale, but the story wasn't just gossip. Invitations began trickling in. The Elder Advocacy Center reached out, asking if she'd be willing to speak at their upcoming event. Margaret hesitated at first. Teachers weren't used to microphones outside classrooms, but Nadine cut her off. You're going. You've been lecturing your whole damn life. Only difference now is your audience claps instead of complains. The event was held in a community hall downtown. Folding chairs lined the space, the smell of coffee and muffins drifting from a back table. Margaret stood at the podium, the microphone squealing once before settling. Dozens of faces looked up at her. Other retirees, caregivers, advocates, even a handful of students studying social work. She spoke simply, without theatrics, about independence, about being called a burden, about paperwork as armor. They say the pen is mightier than the sword, she said, pausing, letting the silence stretch. Well, I say a red pen is mightier still. It doesn't just correct mistakes. It exposes them. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then strong enough to fill the room. Doug clapped from the back, his voice booming when she stepped down. Margaret, you're now case study number 17 in my presentations. Congratulations. You're a cautionary tale and a model solution. Margaret smirked. I suppose that's better than being number 18. Nadine was less restrained, clutching her mason jar of iced tea as if it were champagne. Burden my ass. You just became the poster child for survival. I ought to get you a sash. The laughter that followed was warm, genuine. For once, Margaret felt the tight knot in her chest loosen, the weight shift from defense to defiance. She wasn't hiding anymore. Her story was public. That night, back at home, Margaret folded the article neatly and slid it into a frame beside her crossword puzzles. She thought of Jason, of how the word burden had tasted in his mouth, sharp and careless. Now it belonged to her no longer, but victory always carried shadows. A few days later, Margaret returned from the grocery store to find an envelope on her doorstep, her name written in Jason's familiar handwriting. No postage, hand-delivered. The envelope trembled in Margaret's hands, not because her grip was weak, but because the weight of what it contained pressed heavier than any bill or summons ever could. She smoothed the pages across the kitchen table, the ink cramped, Jason's handwriting familiar and foreign all at once. Dear Mother, I was wrong. The words bled off the paper, desperate, uneven. He filled 5 pages with apologies, explanations, excuses braided into regret. He wrote of pressure, of image, of weakness. He wrote of fear, but he never once wrote the word sorry without circling back to himself. Margaret read every line, lips pressed thin. By the last page, her jaw had hardened into stone. Redemption was not his to write. Not now, not after everything. She folded the letter neatly, almost tenderly, then stood and carried it out back. The evening was still. the air smelling faintly of cut grass and charcoal. She opened the lid of the grill, the same one that had devoured Ridgeview's glossy lies, and struck a match. Emma trailed behind, voice catching. "Grandma, wait! Are you sure you don't even want to keep it? For proof?" Margaret held the letter above the flame. The match hissed, fire crawling quickly up the paper's edge. She dropped it into the grill and watched as Jason's words curled, blackened, and finally turned to ash. The smoke rose, carrying regret into the night sky. She didn't flinch. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "I'm free." Emma watched, her eyes shining with a mix of sorrow and admiration. She reached for her grandmother's hand, and together they stood in the glow of burning apologies until the fire ate the last word whole. The fallout came swift. Cheryl filed divorce papers within a week, her cryptic Facebook posts vanishing as suddenly as they had appeared. Neighbors whispered she finally had enough of him. Can you blame her? Jason, stripped of his job, his marriage, and his inheritance, packed boxes into the back of a friend's truck. Margaret spotted the scene one morning as she watered her zinnias. Jason in sweat-stained clothes, head bent low, loading his life into cardboard. For a moment her chest tightened, not with pity, but with a grim acknowledgement. Choices had teeth, and Jason was finally being bitten by his own. Later that week, Margaret sat with Doug in his office, the smell of strong coffee mingling with the faint musk of old paper. Doug tapped his pen against the trust document, eyeing her over his glasses. "Any last changes before we finalize this?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice firm. "Add a clause for Emma's future children. My legacy isn't just for her, it's for the family line Jason tried to sever." Doug scribbled the adjustment, nodding. "Done. And with this, he's locked out completely. No challenges left." Margaret exhaled, a weight lifting she hadn't even realized she still carried. "Good. Then it's finished. But even finished stories deserve punctuation." That evening, Emma appeared on Margaret's porch, carrying a small, neatly wrapped box. She set it on the table between them, her smile soft but brimming with something deeper. "This is for you, Grandma." Margaret peeled back the paper carefully, revealing a slim velvet case. Inside, nestled against dark fabric, was a pen. Silver, gleaming, the weight of it balanced perfectly in her hand. She lifted it, turning it slowly until the engraving caught the porch light. One word shimmered across the barrel: burdenless. For the first time in months, Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She closed her hand around the pen, her knuckles tight, her heart swelling. Jason had sent her regret. Emma had sent her freedom. Her throat tightened. She blinked hard, but the blur still came, shimmering at the edges of her vision. "Burdenless," she whispered, tasting the word like it was both a wound and a balm. Emma sat across from her, knees pulled up onto the porch swing, watching closely. "Do you like it?" Margaret swallowed, holding the pen to her chest. "It's the finest gift I've ever been given. Because it's not just a pen, it's a verdict." The next morning, Margaret brought the pen with her to Doug Wagner's office. The final stack of trust paperwork waited on his desk, neat and intimidating in equal measure. Doug raised his brows as she uncapped the pen. "New ink?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Fresh weapon." She signed each page with slow precision, the nib gliding across the paper, leaving strokes that felt more permanent than any stone engraving. Each signature carried weight, not only the end of Jason's grasp, but the beginning of Emma's future. Doug gathered the pages, sliding them into their folders. "That's it. Finalized. Your trust is sealed tighter than Fort Knox." Margaret leaned back, her chest finally easing with a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Good. Now my life isn't written in someone else's margins." When they left, Emma fell into step beside her grandmother, still carrying the velvet case the pen had come in. Margaret noticed her granddaughter's shoulders squaring more these days, as if the storm had toughened her instead of breaking her. Back at home, Margaret set the pen carefully in its case and pulled a sealed envelope from her desk drawer. The paper was thick, the seal firm. She handed it to Emma across the kitchen table. Emma frowned. "What's this?" Margaret folded her hands. "The deed to the house. Don't open it yet. Keep it safe. It's yours when the time is right." Emma's eyes widened, her voice catching. "Grandma," Margaret shook her head. "No tears. This house isn't just wood and shingles. It's the one place no one will ever push you out of. You'll know that kind of security one day, and it'll matter more than anything else." Emma clutched the envelope, her lips trembling, then managed a shaky smile. "You taught me what strength looks like. It's this. It's you." The kitchen filled with a silence that wasn't heavy but warm, carrying the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Margaret let the words settle into her bones. For all the battles, the accusations, the betrayals, this was the line she wanted to remember. That evening, Nadine dropped by, her mason jar clinking with fresh iced tea. She set it on the counter, eyes darting to the pen case on the table. "So this is the famous pen, huh?" Margaret grinned. "It's more than a pen. It's a declaration." Doug, who had come by to deliver the final certified copies, chuckled. "A declaration with legal teeth, no less. Margaret, your legacy is untouchable now. It's going to outlast all of us." Margaret sipped from Nadine's tea jar without asking, the mint sharp on her tongue. "Then it's time I stopped spending all my energy on endings." Nadine raised a brow. "And started what?" Margaret's eyes softened, her hand brushing the envelope Emma had tucked into her bag. Time to plant something, time to grow forward. But the world outside her cul-de-sac wasn't done with her story. That night, Margaret sat at her desk, the glow of the laptop casting light across the framed newspaper article on her wall. She opened her Facebook page, her fingers hovering before she began typing. She wrote simply, directly, her version of what had happened. No bitterness, no theatrics, just truth. When she pressed post, she didn't expect much, but within hours, comments and shares flooded in. Old students, colleagues, strangers. Notifications chimed like bells as the story spread far beyond Raleigh. Her words were being carried on thousands of screens, reaching eyes she would never meet. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the silver pen glinting beside the keyboard. For once, she wasn't fighting. She was simply telling, and the world was listening. The afternoon light slanted across Margaret's living room, painting the walls in soft gold. She stood before the shadow box she'd had custom made. A frame of dark walnut, glass polished to a shine. Inside, the silver pen gleamed. The word, burdenless, engraved across its barrel, catching the sun. Just below it sat her final trust, folded neatly, the signatures visible in crisp black ink. And tucked behind it, a newspaper clipping. Retired teacher outsmarts son in a state battle. She lifted her hand, brushing the glass with her fingertips. For the first time in months, the sight didn't feel like armor, it felt like closure. In the kitchen, Emma hovered over her laptop, the sound of fingers tapping keys carrying down the hall. Margaret walked in to find her granddaughter smiling through tears. An envelope lay open beside the computer. The letterhead from a law school Margaret had once only mentioned in passing. Emma looked up, cheeks flushed. "Grandma, I got in. They accepted me. I'm going to study elder law." Margaret's chest swelled, the emotion catching in her throat. "Elder law," Emma nodded, tears spilling freely now. "After everything, after seeing what you went through, I want to fight for people like you. People who don't deserve to be pushed aside." Margaret lowered herself into the chair across from her, reaching across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. "You're taking this mess and turning it into something better." "That's more than I ever dreamed." The front door creaked open, and Nadine stepped in, clutching her mason jar of iced tea as always. She noticed the acceptance letter on the table and froze, squinting through her glasses. "Is that what I think it is?" Emma held it up like a banner, laughter bubbling through her tears. Nadine clapped a hand to her mouth, eyes suddenly wet. Lord have mercy, she whispered. You're really going to law school. Her voice cracked, and she dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Margaret, do you see what you've done? This girl's gonna change the world, Margaret smiled, blinking back her own tears. One stubborn woman at a time. That evening, Doug dropped by with final documents in a leather portfolio. He set them on the table, glancing at Emma's acceptance letter, then back to Margaret. His usual bluntness softened. You know, Margaret, I've worked with hundreds of clients. But this has been different. It's an honor to be part of this ending. Margaret gave a small, wry smile. Endings are just chapters, Doug. Emma here's already started writing the next one. They toasted with coffee instead of champagne, the steam curling between them as if sealing the moment. The next morning, Margaret sat at her desk, the pen Emma had given her resting between her fingers. A final document waited, her planned donation to the Elder Advocacy Center. The amount wasn't small. Years of saving, teaching, and sacrifice had made it possible. She pressed the nib to the page and signed, the ink flowing smooth and steady. With that single motion, she turned personal revenge into public legacy. Her fight wouldn't just protect Emma, it would protect countless others she'd never meet. Later, she carried the signed donation to the frame in her living room. She looked at the pen again, the engraved word shining like a beacon. Burdenless. The word was no longer about her son. It was about her freedom. Margaret stepped back, hands folded in front of her, taking in the framed trust, the pen, the newspaper. The proof that she had rewritten her ending with ink instead of silence. Nadine came up behind her, slipping an arm through hers. Emma stood on the other side, the law school letter clutched against her chest. Doug lingered in the doorway, nodding once in quiet respect. Margaret exhaled slowly, her voice steady as stone. My son said I was a burden, so I carried his name right out of my will.